All right, here we go. Today is our second lecture for AP World History. Last time we went over the basic overview of the timeline and units, and now we are going to continue on with the timeline. Last time we left off talking about the Seven Years' War, Meiji Restoration, and the Treaty of Nanjing. Today, like yesterday, we're going to start off with a topic that's pretty important due to trade, as trade often connects the world. So we will start off with the triangular trade. I'm sure you guys have know about this one. Is connects the old world and the new world and facilitated a lot of trade throughout Americas, Africa, and Europe. So one of the main things you might need to remember for this was is definitely the slave trade. Do you guys know what the slave trade, when they shipped slaves over to America and like the conditions were really bad on the ships, what is that vocabulary word? Do you guys know? Hmm. The Middle Passage. The Middle Passage. So the triangular trade, like the other ones, of course, this one is afterwards. The main difference between this and the Silk Road, Trans-Saharan, was that this one very maritime based trade, right? Crossing the ocean, connecting the Americas and Africa and Europe. But like the other trade routes, they will be asking you about what went to where and how each part, sort of like what they received, what they gave out. It was it. Yeah, as you can see, it's like a triangle. That's why we call it the triangular trade, right? It involves Europe, Africa, and Americas. So Europe basically goes down and wants Africa to send slaves to the Americas where the colonies can have plantations to grow cash crops and then send that back to Europe. Basically, I think Europe benefits off this a lot. Europe also sells a bunch of guns to African kings, and they use those guns to wage wars against each other to capture more slaves to sell even more to be transported. So a key aspect of the triangular trade was basically the exchange of goods between Europe and Africa, and Europe would bring textiles and guns and alcohol to African coastal regions for slaves. So, like we just talked about, the infamous Middle Passage was characterized by horrific conditions aboard the overcrowded slave ships, and it would result in high mortality rates among Africans. So once they arrived in the Americas, they would be sold at auctions and forced into labor because, once again, plantations, and this was basically how it went until much later, where in like the 1850s, 1860s, America eventually abolished slavery. Um, the final leg of the triangular trade over here is transporting goods produced in the Americas, like cash crops and raw materials, back to Europe. So these goods were used to support European industries and satisfy the increasing demand for exotic products in Europe. It had very big impacts on the regions involved, and of course, the most important part is you need to know exactly which regions these are: the Americas, Africa, and Europe. Um, in Africa, basically, like mentioned, it led to a lot of political instability, wars, and increased power struggles among local kingdoms because even though there like millions of slaves and millions of Africans are being enslaved and brought across the sea, um, the kingdoms actually saw this as like a great opportunity, right? Because they were getting paid. They wanted to control like the slave trade, and they basically just fought more wars with the guns that Europe gave them to sell more slaves for more wealth, I guess. The social fabric of many African societies were essentially torn apart by the forced removal of millions of individuals from their homes. In the Americas, the triangular trade basically fueled the growth of plantation economies, contributing to, once again, the flourishing European colonies. Because if you sort of notice, if there's like a DBQ about the Revolutionary War, how it happened, America is basically back then when they were colonies, they are expected to serve Britain and um, fuel mercantilism, right? Um, can you guys quick give me a quick definition of mercantilism in the chat? Right, it's mm, right. So the idea was that Europe wanted to be like um, basically they wanted to benefit off of the trade the most. And often in many political cartoons, you may see things like splitting a pie, right? That's like a symbol of mercantilism. You might see like um, American, like a figure, like a person representing America holding like food to serve to like the British king, right? Basically, they had to grow these crops and then, send it back to support Europe. Of course, we're not just talking about America. This happened with other colonies. The thing is, the most documents and sources usually document America because their revolution came as a result of all of this. The extraction of resources and labor from Africa enabled a lot of wealth accumulation in Europe, and they kept going into colonialism, and they kept expanding colonies. I think you guys may have briefly talked about how the New World was essentially like it was quickly just taken by all of the European nations like France, Spain, um, Britain, etc. And the lasting impact, of course, on America, the Americas is the slavery it had caused racial prejudice. Says that still exists to this day, right? Racism still exists, and it can even be said that today's racism is like due to this triangular trade, the Atlantic slave trade. Um, However, once again, something that all trade routes do is that they don't just bring goods or slaves or guns. They also have a cultural impact. So African and European cultures also exchanged and fused during the slave trade. Africans brought very unique cultural elements like music, dance, religious beliefs, and etc. on, and they brought this to America and I guess also to Europe. So once again, as a trade route, right? As a trade, triangular trade is pretty similar to the other ones, right? They um, connect various parts of the world. They don't just bring across like goods or technologies, they also bring ideas and cultures. And lastly, just remember the impacts that the trade had, right? It's not just a trade route, it also caused slavery to be pretty dominant, especially in the American South, and also caused political instability in Africa because of the huge amounts of slaves they were sending over. And lastly, Europe got super rich. Okay, and with slavery, we'll also talk about abolitionism. So, it's basically the movement to end slavery and liberate slaves across the world. So, the first country to outlaw slavery was France in the 1300s. But even though that happened, um, there were other places that France controlled that actually used slavery. For example, Haiti, right? The Haitian Revolution, they were basically a slave colony that self-liberated due to their revolution, and they were a French colony. So even though France outlawed slavery, well, their colonies could do it. The British abolitionist movement began in the late 18th century, and um, they also outlawed slavery eventually. So there's a quick fun fact, right? So America, about abolitionism, it's very discussed. It's, I guess, in a push as well. Um, During the Civil War, right? What was the Civil War fought on, guys? Pretty simple question.
Slavery.
Yeah, it's whether or not we should free the slaves or not do it, right? So in the Civil War, the South, they actually tried to get Britain to like ally with them. But the thing is, Britain had already outlawed slavery. So So they didn't really want to be affiliated because it didn't really look good on them. So yeah, that pretty nice fun fact, you guys. It's pretty interesting, right? So yeah, exactly. That's right. Because the South, they already had all the plantations. They had a very agricultural based economy. If they lose their slaves, like that's not just like a racism deal for them. Okay. So as you guys may know, America was basically because of abolition and slavery, it was split, right, into the North side, which was um anti-slavery, and the South side, which was pro-slavery. Vermont was the first American state to abolish slavery in 1777, which is actually pretty early on. And the northern U.S. also followed. In 1808, U.S. outlawed international slave trade and um, importation of slaves, but they didn't ban slavery until 1865, which was when the Civil War ended. So we don't actually get to talk about the Civil War and AP World History a lot. We it will be talked about in A Push, but yeah, we just don't focus on America too much yet. Um, the United States passed the 13th Amendment in December of 1865 after the Civil War, which basically ended slavery. However, there was like a part that said except as punishment for a crime. So take that as you will. And in 1888, Brazil was the last country in the Americas to outlaw slavery. So after many hundreds of years of struggle, slavery was eventually declared just you can't do it around the world by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations in 1948. So that's like of course a bit later than where we are in the timeline right now, but that's when slavery just fully became not allowed across the world. Like every country cannot have slavery. Um, Today, children and adult slavery and forced labor are illegal in almost all countries, and as well as being against international law. However, human trafficking for labor is like it affects a lot of people, so that's still a problem. Anyways, that's the abolitionist movement. Just anti-slavery. I don't think they give like enough information about this to use it on like a long essay question, maybe an SAQ perhaps to talk about the impacts or what led up to it. Of course, abolitionism is once again an Enlightenment idea, so that can be used there. Okay, next, the East India Company. Now we're like stepping into imperialism, right? Can you guys give me a quick definition of imperialism? Right. Do you guys recognize the vocabulary word spheres of influence? Yeah. So imperialism, right? So essentially you can like dumb it down and say that it's like a big country taking control of a little country, right? Mostly because the little country could earn the money and but so it's not like outright conquering, like but rather what it is, it's like um putting one under another's control. Anyway, the East India Company was an English and later British joint stock company founded in 1600 and dissolved in 1874. So basically, remember the Indian Ocean trade? Yeah, that's basically what it was used for. It was formed to trade in the Indian Ocean region, initially with the East Indies and later with East India, Asia. The company gained control of like a lot of the India subcontinent and colonized parts of Southeast Asia and Hong Kong. So as you may know, Hong Kong once was like under British jurisdiction. I think parts of that remain like in Hong Kong's culture. I'm not really, I haven't been to Hong Kong, but anyway, that's where like they went there, right? And this ties into like the Opium War and like trading like that, like we talked about last time. So at the peak, the company was the largest corporation in the world by various measures, and it actually had its own armed forces in the form of the company's three presidency armies, about 260,000 soldiers, which actually is surprising because it was like twice the size of the British Army at the time. So this company held a lot of power. The company rose to account for half of the world's trade during the mid 1700s and early 1800s. So that's a large portion. So you guys know how big this thing was. Um, Particularly, they traded basic commodities, um, such as these cotton, silk, sugar, indigo dye, etc. And of course, opium, right? Because opium wars, China. Mhm. The company also initiated the beginnings of the British Empire in India, and they eventually came to rule large parts of India, exercising military power and assuming administrative functions. So essentially, basically a takeover. The company ruled areas in India that gradually expanded after the Battle of Plassey in 1757 and 1858. Most of modern India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh was either ruled by the company or basically had basically were like super closely tied to it by a treaty. Um, After there was an Indian rebellion of 1857, and the Government of India Act of 1858 led to the British Crown assuming direct control of India in the form of the new British Raj. Of course, the company came to an end. It was dissolved in 1874 under the terms of the East India Stock Dividend Redemption Act, enacted 1 year earlier. And then, yeah, the official government machinery of the British Raj had assumed its governmental functions and absorbed its armies, the armies of the 260,000 soldiers. Okay, this one, big economic impact, right? Very key. We can say it's like very big into imperialism, right? Uh, and shows British dominance over the Indian region. And once again, this East India Company was a huge deal, right? It had its own army. It basically did all of the trade over there. So pretty impactful. And we're gonna move on to imperialism now. So we just talked about this, right? In history textbooks, this age is known as the Age of Imperialism. So during this period, European powers basically started controlling the rest of the world. So before they did colonialism, right? And now what they're doing now is spreading their influence rather than like taking new areas. Because, um, well, I guess colonialism just like you take up unoccupied land, right? I mean, technically the Americas were occupied, but they took it anyway. And now with imperialism, what they mostly used these nations that they exercised influence over was, of course, making money. So in 1870, the Dutch controlled the Netherlands Indies, and basically they had their imperialism over there. French, they had rule in the Indochina area, but it wasn't a lot. And the British were reestablishing control of India after the Mutiny of 1857. By 1914, basically the Europeans had ruled over the whole of South and Southeast Asia. In 1870, however, it's very similar. Africa was also very um, the Europeans haven't done much in the Africas, and the settlements were limited to South Africa and Algeria, although there were a few scattered European possessions on the coast of West Africa. I don't know, perhaps maybe you guys have heard of the phrase "a slice of the African cake," right? Europeans were just all fighting to get their slice of Africa to extend their influence, right? Have you guys heard of that? Yeah, the African cake. By 1914, the European rule had spread to the entire continent, with the exception of Liberia and Ethiopia. And the influence also grew in the Ottoman Empire, Persia, and China. So you guys remember when we talked about the Ottoman Empire back in like yesterday's lecture, Unit 3, right? The big kingdoms. Ottoman Empire still surviving. I think it's like the longest lasting one, but it ends up going down, and it gets what nation does it turn into? What nation does the Ottoman Empire turn into? Right, Turkey. The Republic of Turkey, right? I think that happened around the World Wars, so we will talk about that soon. Anyways, it was very extraordinary that a period during which the European powers were so they essentially conquered the world also, but this period was also considered to be a period of relative peace and tranquility. It was sometimes called the Age of Armed Peace. This may be explained by the fact that most historical texts have been written by the Europeans and that Europe experienced a period of peace between this time. Um, However, imperialism did have an impact on Africa, right? Um, the wars were constantly being waged to colonize new areas and to crush rebellions that obviously would occur because people are not satisfied of being exploited. For example, the best known examples of such imperialist conflicts are the Boxer Rebellion in China, the German wars against the Herero people in the Southwest Africa, the South African War, and etc. There were many other conflicts that received a lot of coverage in the newspaper of the day, but most have been forgotten. Um, because, when you go and imperialize an area and then start to exploit the people to earn money for a nation that they don't belong to, of course, rebellions will happen. In most cases, annexation preceded the war because resistance came only later. In these instances, the military operations were not considered acts of war, but rather campaigns against rebels. Okay. And later, I guess we can kind of talk about World War One here. World War One, it's like right after this period, right, 1914, and then right there we get into World War One. Do you guys know what exactly caused World War One? Assassination of Ferdinand, right? Of course, like there were definitely a lot of factors, right? But um but they did have it, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was like the trigger that happened. Of course, Maine, right? Since you guys mentioned Maine, would you guys like to write out what each of, okay, thank you very much. Great job. Um, yeah, so the world wars, right? Before world wars didn't occur, like no world, no, I mean, technically no world war really that we know as world wars happened before. I mean, the Seven Years' War involved a bunch of European nations, but that wasn't considered a world war. So, basically, they had a bunch of people start forming alliances, and once one conflict broke out, everyone just jumped in there. So, of course, the more famously known cause was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand on um, 1914, July 28th. So, we'll sort of like glaze over the world wars a bit because we don't talk about how you fight the wars, right? We don't talk about the strategies um, the generals used. We don't talk about like trench warfare. We talk about like the effects and what came out of the war. So, of course, two world wars, in quick succession, I would say there was like about like a decade and a half in between them, right? Um, the advancements in war technology, of course, these wars killed a lot of people, and more weapons of war were invented. Like people started using gas and like better artillery, better firearms, etc. After the First World War, what was the after the First World War, um, there was the Great Depression, right? But the Great Depression, though we know it as like the American Great Depression, this like thing happened in Europe as well. For example, in Germany, what happened to Germany after the First World War, economic wise, economy wise? Oh yeah, the Treaty of Versailles, but like yeah, hyperinflation, right? Because they could the Treaty of Versailles was like super bad for them because it was like super punishing and um America was like, yeah, we'll help you pay it off, right? And then America, their economy collapsed and they're like, yeah, actually we need our money back. And Germany just can't take that. So Germany tries to, print more money to sort of like make up for it, but that's like not how printing money works. That's not how gaining money works. So in the end, what happens is hyperinflation, right? Um, I don't know exactly what the number is, but I think there was like a statistic that said that before this hyperinflation, you can like buy bread for a certain price, right? And then afterwards, like the price just increased like 10,000 fold, maybe even more. And of course, um, the Treaty of Versailles ended up becoming Hitler's like driving force to like rally the Germans to basically help support him. Um, so the World Wars very not common in DBQ and LEQ because like um y- the DBQs and LEQs, right? They want you to evaluate stuff, like evaluate the extent to which something changed or something continued or compare and contrast. The World Wars, they don't have much to do with that. You might get like propaganda of the World War on the SAQ or maybe like you want to talk about certain events and how it led to it, and maybe they'll like ask you about Maine and stuff. Um, yeah, unfortunately, they don't like talk a lot about all the strategies and how the war progressed. Anyways, next we will be talking about let's say a more interesting part, a better part that might be asked on longer essays. So in between the First World War and the Second World War, one of the nations involved in there underwent a revolution and became an entirely new one and adopted a belief. You guys know what I'm talking about? Mm. What's the revolution called? I mean, it's very obvious, but the Russian Revolution, the Bolsheviks, right? The Bolsheviks, led by Lenin and then later succeeded by Stalin. So we're going to go to that. So the Russian Revolution, a very, very key thing to know about. It was basically the period of political and social change in the Russian Empire. Remember the Russian Empire we sort of talked about all the way, Peter the Great, Ivan the Terrible, and now it's time to end it because the empire was now super weak and the people rose up. This period saw Russia abolish its monarchy and adopt a socialist form of government following two successive revolutions and a very bloody civil war. Um, so the Russian Revolution can be seen as a precursor for other European revolutions that occurred in the aftermath of World War One, such as the German Revolution of 1918 and 1919. This one was one of the most explosive political events of the 20th century, right? Quick vocab or person check. Who wrote the Communist Manifesto and basically was the father of communism? What is name? Yes. Karl Marx, right? So he sort of inspired this communism. He started communism, right? In theory, they think it's great, right? But that's not how this ended out. Anyway, um, economic hardship, food shortages, and government corruption all eventually led to the Bolshevik Revolution led by Vladimir Lenin to seize the power and destroy the tradition of Tsarist rule. The Bolsheviks then turned into the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Wait one second. Let me check if yes, here it is. The Russian Revolution timeline. This text is kind of small, but it's basically just a series of events, right? So we start with 1917 at the beginning of the revolution, right? Tsar, they led by Vladimir Lenin, the Bolsheviks. They win the Russian Civil War in 1920, and then Lenin later dies. Um, and then, well, Stalin takes over, and the Second World War was 1939. So in between this time, it's like it's relatively okay, I guess. And afterwards, um, I don't know if you, I mean, I was kind of interested in how like the alliances in World War II. Who did the USSR, which side did the USSR initially um ally with? Like at the start. Yeah, at the start, um, Hitler, right? He made a promise to Stalin that, we're gonna be on the same side, and I'm not gonna invade you. But that was a lie. Hitler mostly did that because, see, in the map of Europe, right, he wants to fight against France and Britain, they're on like the left side of Germany, right? So if he made Russia or the Soviet Union at the time also has enemy, he would be facing the war on two fronts, right? So he would have to like support two sides. He didn't want to fight that because that's just not a good idea. So he did ally with the Russians at the time, but of course later on he betrayed them, and then the Soviet Union joined the Allies to fight against Germany. And you might think that, Hitler's betrayal was so stupid, right? Why would he do that? But it actually did work at the start, right? He pushed them super far back. And then what happened? What happened that this is like I think this has become quite quite a funny thing that has happened because every time when or the Soviet Union is in trouble, when it becomes winter, they instantly gain the upper hand. So they do eventually like start getting the upper hand once winter arrived and Hitler is pushed back. World War II ends 1945, right? And then the Soviet Union is super powerful now, and well, of course, US is also very powerful, and that's when the Cold War begins because the United States, right, is known for being. They did say that they were going to be the arsenal of democracy to protect democratic nations around the world, but then the USSR is an authoritarian communist government, totalitarian, right? So conflicting ideals becomes a Cold War. Basic knowledge check. Why was the Cold War a Cold War? Like, why didn't they fight? I mean, this is pretty easy. Just need to check that you guys. Okay, guys, that's not. Yes, nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons. MAD. MAD. Okay. The Russian Revolution, we're gonna move on from the Russian Revolution now. Once again, we're not gonna talk about um, the Second World War because they're not gonna test you on like Blitzkrieg, right? They're not gonna talk about. Well, I mean, there might be an MCQ question, right? What was like the effective way that Hitler used to like quickly conquer like France or something? They might have a question like that, but you are not going to see the World War on the LEQs or DBQs. Hopefully. I mean, like even if it were on there, it would be super easy because they just don't have enough for you to argue about. However, the Russian Revolution and the Cold War, this is way more uh, FRQ likely because of the actual historical impacts it has. Um, the communist ideas and like the revolutionary ideas, and then like a bunch of like different Cold War ideas, right? And post World War II ideas, those would be tested a lot on. Okay, we're gonna move on to the Cold War. Now, the Cold War, 1947 to 1991, basically it's like a rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. And um, they basically, like you guys said, they were at a stalemate because of nuclear weapons, because of MAD, mutually assured destruction. If one side were to launch a nuclear weapon at the other could launch like 500 back, and then the other side would launch like 600 back, and everyone would just get bombed. And of course, nobody wants that outcome. Nobody wants to like just turn the Earth into a nuclear wasteland. I mean, I'm sure like many video games have considered the possibility, but like no one actually wants that to happen to us. Like it would suck living like that. Um, but the main thing about what caused it was America was democratic and the Soviet Union was like communist. America was like the height of capitalism and democracy and freedom, while the Soviet Union was like everything that they stood against. So they wanted to sort of stop the Soviet Union from expanding their influence because communism is like spreading. America does not want that to happen. Mm, yes, so I see you guys have mentioned the containment of communism. So that was a very nice, I mean, not very, that was a very, very big doctrine by the US about how to go through with this. There were two main policies, which I guess I only talk about this because I'm doing a push. They talked about detente and containment. So a bunch of like we passed through a bunch of presidents during this part, right? And a lot of them had a bunch of policies and how to go through things. Um, the term Cold War is used because they couldn't actually fight. So what America was going for was to stop the spread of communism, to basically say, yeah, you can, because it would be very hard to actually just completely destroy communism, right? Right? Like make the USSR into non-communist. That is not something you can just do. So what they did was fought a bunch of proxy wars to stop the spread of communism. And of course, if America wanted to stop them, then the Soviet Union would want to support them. Okay. Can you guys get some examples of proxy wars that were fought? Yeah, Korea, Vietnam. Okay. Hmm. Oh, right. What happened in Cuba? What happened in Cuba? Mm, missiles, right? Okay. Anyways, we'll go to the proxy wars in a bit. I'm going to talk a bit more about World War II. So during the Second World War, the US and the Soviets there fought together as allies against Nazi Germany. However, they weren't actually very friendly, right? They were never truly friendly. Americans had been like very wary of Soviet communism and especially Stalin's tyrannical rule, but and also, the Soviets resented Americans because they refused to give them a leading role in the international community, as well as America's delayed entry into World War II. Because why did America actually wanted to stay out of World War II? Because they just came out of the Great Depression. They really did not want to fight. However, what actually like got them into the World War? What got them in, right? Japan, right? Pearl Harbor. So, however, America, by the time they joined the Second World War, the German attack into far into the Soviet Union territory, and then that actually already happened. So millions of Russians actually died. So they kind of like, America, why didn't you join earlier? You could have like prevented all this from happening. Anyway, these grievances basically just ripened into an overwhelming sense of mutual distrust. And especially when America dropped the nuclear bomb, and then they had never told they had never told the Russians about this. So that just like that did not help their relations. Um, the Soviet later expansionism into Eastern Europe by spreading like their ideals sort of fueled many Americans' fears of a Russian plan to control the world, right? They feared that communism was going to take over. However, the USSR basically saw the US as basically trying to restrict them and like very being very hostile. And so in this atmosphere, nobody could really be blamed for the Cold War. And in fact, many historians actually think that it was inevitable because their opposing ideals would eventually cause them to clash. So the Cold War reached its peak in 1948 to 53. In this part, the Soviets unsuccessfully blockaded the western held sectors of West Berlin, and the US and European allies formed NATO, which basically bonded them together. And I was like, yeah, if you attack me, we will all attack you. Basically, they resisted Soviet presence in Europe. In 1949, the Soviets exploded their first atomic warhead, so the American monopoly on the atomic bomb was gone. And then in 1949, the Chinese communists also came into power in mainland China, and then in 1950, the Soviet-supported Communist government of North Korea invaded the U.S.-supported South Korea in that time. So that was a major proxy war that many of you guys mentioned, the Korean War. It lasted until 1953, and like it, uh, it ended in a stalemate with neither side really like won there. But in the end, I guess America did get their containment of communism by having them sign a treaty, right? Having them sign a treaty in which they wouldn't fight anymore. So basically, America prevented the entirety of Korea to become communist, yet they could not stamp out the communism that was already there in North Korea. From 1953 to 1957, the Cold War tensions were relaxed somewhat, mostly because Joseph Stalin died in 1953, but the standoff still remained, right? They were still against each other. In 1962, it was the Cuban Missile Crisis, which we just talked about, um, which they almost fought, right? They almost sent uh, it almost became heated. Missiles were put in Cuba, and both sides were basically but neither side actually wanted to do this, right? Because they know mutually assured destruction, but it was almost the breaking point. However, the two superpowers did have an agreement to withdraw the missiles. Soon, though, in 1963, they signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, and they banned basically above ground nuclear weapons testing. But the Cuban Missile Crisis, also hardened the Soviets' determination to never be humiliated by their military inferiority. And then came the arms race, right? They were both racing to make a higher and higher tech weapons. And then there was also many races, right? It wasn't just the arm race. There was also the space race, which we will talk about in a bit. The major split had occurred between the USSR and China in 1960, and basically America sort of like wanted that to happen. They didn't want China and the Soviet Union to like band together because the Soviet Union was already so powerful. This was, I guess, a good thing for America. In the meantime, Western Europe and Japan achieved pretty good economic growth in the time, reducing their relative inferiority to the US. And less powerful countries also started to assert their independence and become more resistant to superpower coercion. In 1970s, the Cold War tensions were eased once again by the SALT treaties. Do you guys know the SALT treaties? The Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, the SALT treaties or agreements, right? So people basically they just took down a bunch of missiles. They set limits on anti-ballistic missiles and other strategic missiles capable of carrying nuclear weapons. So in the end, the Cold War began to break down in the late 1980s because Mikhail S. Gorbachev came into office in the Soviet Union. And Gorbachev, he was known as being very actually democratic and kind of against having such authoritarian communist government because Gorbachev really saw that the citizens of the USSR were actually not having a great time. There was famines and people couldn't get enough food because the arms race had essentially drained the USSR of their money, and they didn't have enough to keep up. And even if they could keep up, they would be taking more and more from their people. So Gorbachev just and Reagan, who was the U.S. president at this time, Ronald Reagan, they eventually came into they just they had a few talks, I guess, and in the end, he Gorbachev dismantled the totalitarian aspects of the Soviet system, and the Soviet Union later collapsed with 15 newly independent nations born from it, including Russia, with now a democratically elected anti-communist leader. The Cold War was much longer than the World Wars, and frankly, it is very impactful. So, the topic of communism and Cold War may very well appear on the DBQ. We have so much documents about that. So keep in mind about the ideologies, the Cold Wars, and the tensions about it. It might also be a good idea to remember, for example, which times are times of relative ease of tensions and what caused it. For example, remember like the SALT treaties and like the or the Cuban Missile Crisis, which actually heightened tensions. Okay, the Cold War is a big part. So that I think we talk more about the Russia side of it rather than the American side. In the American side, there's Nixon. Nixon was um, President Richard Nixon. He was in office during the Cold War. He didn't really end it. Once again, Reagan was like the guy who did it. Nixon is the main détente guy, who détente is relaxation towards the Soviet Union. So they signed a bunch of treaties that eased tensions, and basically he was like, "Yeah, we will just hold back a bit, ease the tensions." Um, yeah. However, many other uh policies such as Eisenhower. Do you guys know who Eisenhower is? Do you guys know Eisenhower? What did he do in World War II? Like that's like what he's famous for, right? He was a, well, he was a general. He was a general during World War II. Mm. Eisenhower, he was very big on containment. He did not want communism to be spread. Um, despite Nixon's efforts to like cool down the Cold War, afterwards in Reagan's term of presidency, it heated up again, and Reagan believed that the spread of communism anywhere threatened freedom everywhere. So as a result, he provided a bunch of financial and military aid to anti-communist governments and insurgencies around the world. In the end, Gorbachev he he had a policy that was basically um, eh, basically saying economic reform and political openness, glasnost. Mm. So Gorbachev wanted to better the lives of people. And in one of the key parts of the end of the Cold War, the Berlin Wall was destroyed. So, what does the Berlin Wall do, right? Why was Berlin separated? Do you guys know that? Why was Berlin and Germany overall separated? What are you guys doing in the chat? What are you guys doing? Yes. Anyways, the halves of Berlin were separated for US influence and USSR influence, right? So, well, the opposite actually. The USSR side, their conditions were actually much worse than the US side. So a bunch of people were just leaving, and they didn't want that to happen because like that's just that that speaks volumes about this USSR leadership in there. Anyways, they by 1991, the Soviet Union itself had fallen apart and the Cold War was over. Okay, what's my next slide? Okay, this is a quick timeline. I feel like it's a bit like the quality of the picture is a bit low. Oh yeah, the something very interesting that I don't know how heavily weighted it will be on the exam. The Bay of Pigs invasion. What happened in the Bay of Pigs invasion? Oh here, Bay of Pigs invasion. It was actually very, yeah. The US government, they tried to send Cuban exiles over there to overthrow the communist government, and they failed, and it looked really bad on the US. It did not look very good. Yeah. So that's like one thing I think I didn't really talk about before. Yeah, anyway, this timeline, we already went through most of the stuff, so we're just gonna keep moving on. Okay, the Truman Doctrine, right? The Truman Doctrine, named after, of course, President Truman. In a speech to Congress, President Harry Truman said that the U.S. needs to stop communist domination, and basically it was cited as the official declaration of the Cold War. Um, it basically addressed that. It basically said. The Soviet Union was the center of all communist activity, and America should basically prevent communists from spreading. Communism could attack through outside invasion or internal subversion, and U.S. needs to protect nations from communist aggression. Some people may have said this was too extreme, right? Some people thought that um, Truman's logic was over the top or something, but. Um, and this did like shape foreign policy towards communism in the US. I mean, US foreign policy to communism. So, basically, they would go on. This is like one of the things that led to US helping its neighboring countries and well not and also proxy countries like other democracies against communism once again from the proxy wars Korea, Vietnam, the Middle East, right, Cuba. America is trying its hardest to prevent communism to be spread. And they sometimes succeeded, they sometimes didn't. For example, in the case of Cuba, in the case of Vietnam, they didn't really succeed. In the case of maybe Korea, they, I guess, have succeeded. Yeah. So the Truman Doctrine successfully convinced many that the United States was locked in a life or death struggle with the Soviet Union, and it set the guidelines for over 40 years of US and Soviet relations. Next, the arm race. Oh, another big thing in in the Cold War. I mentioned this earlier, the US did not tell the Soviet Union about Hiroshima and the atomic bomb. So the Soviets were, of course, not very happy about that. Um, this is also super expensive. Like I mentioned before, this also ended up it was one of the factors that caused the collapse of the Soviet Union later on, because they just cannot keep up with the amount of money that America had. Because they were keeping up with the arms race, right? But doing so came at a very high cost of a lot of money, and the Soviet Union ended up not having those funds. And the arms race, however, was something that the Soviet Union could just turn away from if they wanted to actually fight the Cold War, like keep up in it. Because if they let America get ahead, then they would be toast. They would be gone. If America finds out like some way to just nuke the entirety of the Soviet Union super, super fast without detection, then that's just not something that they wanted to happen. The United States casted a very wary eye over the Soviet Union's quest for world dominance, as they expanded their like communist power and influence over Eastern Europe and other places. The Soviet Union, however, also thought that the United States was just being it's just interfering with what they wanted to do, and America was like building up a bunch of weapons and stuff. Um, and yeah, the Hiroshima thing, atomic bomb, that just fueled the distrust. Like, why didn't you tell us about that? Um, and then there was also the space race, right? What do we know about the space race, guys? What do we know about the space race during this part? Okay, well, Elon Musk, I don't know if maybe he was alive at this time. Sputnik, the Sputnik. Right, so a lot of things, I think, guys, let me ask you guys a question, open-ended question. Who do you guys think won the space race? Who won the space race? I mean, historians and people often say it's the US. But other people argue that, in the space race, the USSR has like won every smaller race, right? They got the first satellite up there, Sputnik. They got the first man in space. They did a bunch of stuff, and then America won the space race by setting foot on the moon, which I think a lot of people have conspiracies that it was faked, it was filmed in Hollywood, and and that the whole thing was just a sham to like basically demoralize the Soviet Union. But we won't get into like all this controversy and like all the theories and stuff because we won't be talking about that on the exam. Um, so. Space race, pretty SAQ likely. You might get like a propaganda poster about something like that. Um, just pretty good developments in the Cold War. Okay, there was also, um, yeah, so in the end, the space race effectively ends after America sets foot on the moon. I think recently America has been doing the Artemis missions. Um, Guys, well, I don't know what you guys are doing in chat, but it's this, yeah. Anyways, next is the Marshall Plan. Now, I think this does occur a bit before the Cold War and everything. It's also known as the European Recovery Program. So, the World War II, it was fought on two fronts. Which two fronts were those? Like the regions. Yeah, the Pacific and European fronts, right? So that's why we also have like two victory days. We have the Victory in Europe Day and Victory in Japan Day. I think Europe was like May 8th, maybe, and Victory in Japan was like September 2nd. So um so in Europe, but these European nations suffered a lot from the war, right? They fought through it mostly, right? America was like, the American homeland was never attacked like directly, except for Pearl Harbor. But besides that, the mainland of America was like never touched. So what they could do, but that wasn't the same for like you can't say the same for Britain or France, especially not France. And Germany, of course, also needed it. So Truman signed the Marshall Plan on April 3rd, 1948. And basically it was post-war aid, to prevent the fall of all of these nations. Um, the It was enacted in 1948 and provided more than 15 billion USD to help finance rebuilding efforts on the European continent. Not all participating nations benefited equally. So nations such as Italy, who had fought along with the Axis powers, like Nazi Germany, and those who remained neutral, like Switzerland, they received less assistance than the countries who fought with the United States and the other allied powers. However, an exception was West Germany. Though all of Germany was damaged significantly toward the end of World War II, a viable and revitalized West Germany was seen as essential to the economic stability in the region. and as a not so subtle rebuke of the communist government and economic system on the other side of the Iron Curtain in East Germany. Great Britain received 1/4 of the total aid, so Great Britain got a lot of it, and but France got a little less than 1/5 of the funds. The Marshall Plan is considered a key catalyst um, for the formation of NATO because giving all this aid, right, America's gaining allies. A military alliance between North American and European countries established in 1949. Interestingly, in the decades since its implementation, the true economic benefit of the Marshall Plan has actually been very debated because reports at the time suggest that by the time it took effect, Western Europe was already like recovered. So like, did they really need it? But that's to be debated. Maybe perhaps that'll show up on your SAQ, evaluate the extent to which the Marshall Plan was effective in rebuilding Europe. Okay, I think we are going a bit over, so I'm going to wrap up this real quick and we will finish the rest of the events of the timeline tomorrow and move on into global connections. Lastly, we'll go over the political legacy of the Marshall Plan. So, um, the Marshall Plan, the legacy tells a different story, right? Given the refusal to participate on the part of the so-called Eastern Bloc of the Soviet states, the initiative certainly reinforced divisions that were already beginning to take root on the continent. So, you guys know what the CIA stands for? What does the CIA stands for? Yeah, the Central Intelligence Agency. So the CIA, at the time, it received 5% of the funds allocated under the Marshall Plan. The CIA used these funds to establish front businesses in several European countries that were designed to further US interests in the region. So I think that's like a spreading influence over there to prepare for the Cold War. The agency also allegedly financed an anti-communist insurgency in Ukraine, which at the time was a Soviet satellite state. Um, so the Marshall Plan was generally lauded for the desperately needed boost it gave America's European allies. George C. Marshall, the designer of the plan basically said that our policy is not directed against any country, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. Still, efforts to extend the Marshall Plan beyond its initial 4-year period stalled with the beginning of the Korean War in 1950. The countries that received funds under the plan didn't have to repay the United States as the monies were awarded in the form of grants. However, the countries did return roughly 5% of the money. That's not that much, but it's something, right? 5% of the money to cover the administrative cost of the awards of the plan's implementation. Okay, since we are going a bit over, we will stop here and we will continue on next time. We're going to quickly wrap up this. I think it's just Unit 9 afterwards. So tomorrow we'll go over Unit 9. We'll make global connections. So we'll sort of like go through the time periods and see what's happening around the world at the time. And then if we have time at the end, we can like look at a few LEQs and perhaps how we can approach them. Okay, that is all for today. Thank you guys for tuning in to today's lecture, and I am very excited to see you guys again tomorrow. Oh, oh, we did not need to see that.